this teaching, and later you apply it to outside the church and try to represent you the best way we can. Right?
All right. So, I want to start by saying, last week we talked about what people seek in a relationship, those 17 things. And we talked about when this was done. And I went back and looked at it, and it was done January 2022. So it was after COVID, of course, committed. We talked about that not being on this list. That committed work, and I understand why. Part of that is because as we come out of COVID, we were having a tough time being committed to relationships, for one thing. We've been closed in for so long, it just created that issue. The other thing is the youth do not want to feel committed today in relationships. That's what they were explaining partway through that whole article, is that's why the word committed, probably more like not used, that the youth don't want to feel that committed dedication, that they don't want to kind of tie that to a relationship word. So that's why that word was left out. Okay? So that was January 2022. And what I want to say is last week we talked about relationships. We talked about quite a bit about relationships, what we want out of a relationship, what we need out of a relationship, what a relationship is, and how it forms, how it's made, those sort of things. And so last week we ended with Morgan Scott Peck and his saying, and I'm going to start right there where we ended with him. I'm not going to give you his history again. I'm not going to do all that. But I am going to do those two paragraphs. We're going to start there, and I'm going to read them out to you. Kind of. I read a lot. I know that I don't have that. I know that's crazy, right? But I had short-term memory issues from when I had my stroke. So I can't remember a lot right off the bat. So you're going to see that a lot from me. I'm sorry. Not that I don't know the material. I've known it this many times. It's just that somewhere down the line, I get lost in the moment. Okay? My brain doesn't work that way anymore. So, now, Morgan Scott Peck. I told you that he had wrote a book. The book was The Road Less Traveled. It's a case study of all the things, all the years that he had studying relationships, all kinds of relationships. Okay? It was a bestseller on the New York Times bestseller for 13 straight years. Says a lot. And it sold more than 5 million copies, which again, says a lot. 5 million copies, a lot of books to sell out over those years. And as I said, his specialty was how relationships are formed, especially spiritual relationships. His idea was that discipline is the means of spiritual evolution or growth. And what gives discipline the needed energy is motive, the energy is love. Okay? Now, as I said, he would be the first to admit there are many definitions of love, and love is divided into various categories: eros, phileo, agape, perfect love, imperfect love. But his definition of true love is the will to extend one's self for the purpose of nurturing one's own or another spiritual growth. Sounds a lot like agape, right? Sounds a lot like agape. In spiritual growth, love drives discipline to uplift oneself or another spiritually. It is the act of extending one's limits, and that takes effort. A person extends their limits only by exceeding them. We walk that extra mile or take those extra steps, and we know that from Jesus, right? That's what he talked about. Taking those extra steps, walking the extra mile. After all, love is not effortless, but effortful. By extending their limits, a person grows. The act of loving is an act of self-evolution, even when the purpose of that act is someone else's spiritual growth. And then finally, love is an act of will, with both intention and action. And of course, will also implies choice. We can choose to love or not to love another. Okay? That's not all Peck said, though, and I'm going to bring that up here coming in. Now, we often say that love is giving our heart to another. The problem is we are constantly protecting our hearts from being hurt. This protection or barrier comes from a combination of our values, morals, and ethics. Values are a person's ability to judge between right and wrong. It's a deep-rooted system that guides a person's decisions. Morals come from our values and set the standard of behavior and belief concerning what is and what is not acceptable for them personally to do. And then ethics determines what behaviors or beliefs are right or wrong. Okay? Now, when a person says, I'm falling in love, this is according to Peck now, what most people mean by falling in love isn't love at all. He said when most people say, and this is from his studies, when most people say I'm falling in love, they're referring to a euphoric or sexual feeling, that physical attraction. It's that feeling that sends electric shock waves all through you when that person smiles at you or simply touches your hand. And we find that people fall in love easily and fall out of love just as easily. Peck says that true love begins when the falling in love feelings end and you accept that person with all their faults and all of your faults, and you still choose to love them. You have the will. Now, this is where the barriers come in. This is going to be important throughout our entire lesson. This is what Peck was talking about when he talks about barriers. And he goes in great detail. It's chapter after chapter, but I'm going to try to get this down in about a 10-minute speech. All right? Now, barriers. They're there to protect you around your heart. Okay? They protect your heart, your emotions, all those things. Now, when people go out to search for that special someone, they bring with them a barrier of protection that surrounds them to protect their hearts. And again, that barrier is made up of our values, morals, and ethics. When you meet that special someone, these barriers, you're protecting your heart, what happens is you let those barriers fall. And we've seen that, right? We see that a lot with people who fall in love. What's the first thing they do? They act kind of giddy. They act funny, right? They do anything for that person in that moment. And their barriers all fall. And you've exposed your heart, and you've exposed yourself, right? So those barriers fall. Now, one or two things will happen over a period of time. First is that person eventually does something or says something that irritates you. That teeth-clenching thing that you just can't accept. Okay, so that like that teacher scratching the chalkboard, right, coming down, that thing that irritates you. It can happen. And what happens is your barriers start to come back up. They start to form around your heart one by one by one, and they keep coming until they protect your heart, your feelings. And that relationship's got to end. You say, I don't love you anymore. I can't accept you in my barriers. We aren't compatible. You are not compatible with my values, morals, and ethics. So I can't accept you in my barrier. And that happens, right? We see that a lot. Now, the second possibility is that someone special steps inside your barriers. You've let them down and you've exposed yourself. And after some time, you grow to accept them within your barriers. You find common ground, okay? And you stay in that falling in love stage. And eventually, the two of you get married, and together over time, you build this set of barriers, a married couple, they build this set of barriers through compromise that they both can accept. These barriers that they both can happen, right? And these barriers are going to be important. And I'll tell you why. It'll be throughout the lessons. So, you've got this compromise that both of you can accept. Now, you both live within that system of barriers that you have created and share in, that you feel safe in, you trust in, and believe in that system that you two have built together. Okay? Then, within that system of love, values, morals, and ethics together, you decide, or sometimes undecided, that you want to share that with someone else. So a child is born. Okay? Within that boundary, after years of marriage, your child accepts your love, your values, your morals, and your ethics. Sometimes fully, sometimes partially, some not at all. and then they form their own set of barriers. But throughout your lifetime, those set of barriers become flexible. Okay, and I'm gonna use another example here later on, so just hang on. Your lifetime, those flexibles become flexible as you have son-in-laws and daughter-in-laws and mother-in-laws and father-in-laws and grandchildren all coming in and intertwining in your life. Now, let's say, for instance, your daughter marries someone that you aren't politically compatible with. You really don't like this person at all, and you don't like what they're spewing. But every Thanksgiving, you still have to invite him to dinner, right? You may not like him, you may not like his views, but you invite him to dinner and you want to keep peace. So you compromise your barriers at some point. Same thing happens at Christmas time, right? You look at the person and say, I don't want to buy that guy anything. You don't want to be too kind because you don't really accept him or her or whoever that person is, a grandchild, whatever it may be. You really aren't just compatible. And we have people like that in our family, right? Don't we all have people like that in our family that something, they rubbed you the wrong way? Maybe it's your own child. And but every Thanksgiving, I don't care. It's like I always say, I don't care. Every Thanksgiving, me and my daughters, my one daughter, I can't see eye to eye on her politically on any level. But I love spending time with her. She's my daughter, and she's my firstborn. And I love spending time with her. So we have agreed, both of us, we don't talk about politics, we don't talk about religion. We will talk about everything else, but we are not going to talk about those things. And so we've kept peace. I have compromised my barriers, what I believe, right? I've compromised a great deal just to spend time with her. And that's why I say, we all compromise. We all get that, right? Don't we all have that at holidays? Things like that. It happens to all of us. Barriers. So you compromise how you interact with all these people as they intertwine with your life. Some things, like I said, you can accept. Some you don't. Some you agree with, some you can't. But the barriers are always present. But there's always an exception, just like this one, okay? Another couple start with the same love, morals, ethics, values, this other family. But somewhere down the line, one of them decides to step outside those barriers. And one of the parents decides to have an affair. Okay? They have chosen this act over time and mostly in secret. They no longer see the love, values, morals, and ethics the same way they used to with that partner. And when the other spouse finds out, they are hurt, broken, and instantly both parties involved form their own set of barriers from this sudden lack of trust, of respect, this lack of respect, lack of love. And the injured party becomes hurt, terrified, angry, creating doubt and distrust within that person and with their partner, right? Confusion, pain, and much more. But what has happened is the hurt party instantly, him or her, instantly throws up those barriers and protects their heart. They're sitting there saying, this is never going to happen again. I don't want this to happen. I'm hurting. I'm in pain. And I'm going to protect my heart at all costs. Right? And then you have the other person who the constant badgering from the wife is standing there taking that, and he or she may get defensive, trying to defend what they did, trying to find answers. They may be trying to reconcile, but it's awful hard, so they set up their own barriers to protect their own feelings, their own heart. Okay? Now, we see that they both have created their own set of barriers to protect their heart, their feelings, and their pain. And that happens. Now, the ones that suffer are the children. This is all according to Peck, and these barriers become important later on. Children begin to develop their own set of barriers through childhood, and some even into adulthood. We as parents must help them develop healthy barriers. If we don't help them set these barriers in place, society will. Okay? Children are most impressionable in their early teens. If the parents in the marriage are loving, nurturing, and stay together, it becomes much easier to develop their sense of discipline, love, values, morals, and ethics. If a child goes through that experience of one parent being unfaithful to another, they tend to distrust their parents' values, morals, and ethics, and instead seek those things out by what society offers. Right? So they find how to protect their heart somewhere else because they don't believe what's happened here, the distrust that's happening, the anger in the child. They don't trust that. So they form their own set of barriers through their friends, through their experiences, what has happened to them, and they form their own set of barriers. Now, God is the one that sets our discipline, love, morals, and values in place when we become Christians. When we become a new Christian, we take on God's standards of love, morals, ethics, and values. We guard our hearts from the world, but God doesn't protect his heart. You see, God's love is perfect, as is his values, morals, and ethics. God's perfect love casts out all fear. See, he has no fear of his heart, right? Like we do. So he knows that he has done all he can to get you to choose to come to him. He knows that he has put up the perfect plan of salvation for you. So he knows that I don't have to protect my heart, right? But as you will see throughout this lesson, as we go on, this series of lessons, God's heart can be hurt. And he can get pretty angry about it sometimes. But he can be hurt. Okay? Now, this was my example about barriers in a marriage or family setting. But our barriers are always present. I want to give another example real quick. For example, you yourself or a friend or someone has told a secret to someone they thought would be safe telling the secret to. But later you found out it got out. And it was embarrassing, or hurtful, or shameful. And you, or their barriers, what happens to us? They come flying up to protect ourselves, right? They come flying up to protect ourselves. And you hear that person say, "Never again will that happen to me. Never again will I tell that person a single thing. I will never share a secret with them again." And you see that barrier that was around their heart and feelings thickens just a little bit. And it makes it much harder, much harder for someone to get close to them, to build a relationship with them. Now, we think about barriers and what barriers set us apart from God, right? In our own hearts. We set barriers. We have barriers of what? Sin, right? That allow us not to have a relationship with God. We have barriers of all kinds, and I'm going to ask you about those. If you can come up with some more in just a little bit here. Okay. So, as I said, as these things happen to us and we experience these things that happen around us, our barriers become thicker. And it's a little harder to get to know that person. We use that same thing against God sometimes. And that's where I'm going to stop with barriers. They're going to be throughout, we're going to talk about them a little bit probably throughout each lesson. There's a little bit about that. I knew something about that years ago. I learned about barriers years ago from a friend who told me about this book and shared it with me. And so I learned that concept quite some time ago. But are there any questions or comments to that? Anything anybody wants to add or ask? And I will do my best to answer it. Nothing. Oh, Brenda, go ahead.
I think one of the other things, I mean, we put up the barrier of sin ourselves, but I think another barrier that you see in the Old Testament that they put up is that they deny God's existence, and that creates a barrier. You know, like when they turn to idols and stuff, they kind of are turning away from God and towards something that really isn't a God, but it still creates a barrier. And again, that's of our own making.
And think about that as their experiences, they see them as the Israelites go on and move forward, right? They wanted to be like everybody else, right? They wanted to be like these other nations. And when God says, listen, I give you the 10 Commandments, I want you to behave in a certain way. And this is what the 10 Commandments were, was I want your behavior to be in the light of these other nations and have this understanding that we act a certain way. But when they don't, that creates a barrier because, listen, I have a widow over here. Her husband just died, and she's renting the place for me. But you know what? I'm not making any money. She doesn't make an income. So out she goes. And that breaks God's law. Or when it comes to that end of the year, that 7th year, when they say, hey, this field we're supposed to lay fallow. We're not supposed to take any grain from it, and we're supposed to leave that for the poor and the edges so they could pick up and have some way to make money and feed themselves. And they say, no, get out of my field. I have to make a profit on this. And they did those things. And they say, hey, loans at 25%. I mean, that's unheard of, right? Yeah, loans at 25 to 27% for their own people. So, yeah, you can see how their experiences, how those barriers kept them from seeing God, right? Morgan.
A lot of times you'll see guilt and shame thrown up a barrier between you and God. I know in my life.
Yeah, absolutely. You're ashamed of something you've done, and you know what? Here's the thing. I don't want to have to tell it. I don't want to have to go before the church and repent for something, or I don't want to come to that pew. You're too ashamed, right? And you're too ashamed of what you've done. So those set barriers in place that allow us to not build a relationship with God. Those barriers become important. And we all have them. We all have them. Sometimes we thicken them a little when we get hurt, and sometimes we don't think about them at all. That's why you see some people are so flighty, right? They fall in love, in and out of love, and they're bouncing everywhere. They don't have much for barriers, right? They learn something else. But then you have some people who are tough, right? Their barriers is, I'm not getting close to you. Get back. I don't want to get married. I don't want to have children. I don't want these things. I want a career. They're very selfish in their barriers and what they do. And they become very worldly. Brenda.
Anger is another one. You know, I've seen people leave the church, get so angry at God because mama died or my child died, and they get very angry and they leave the church and they turn away from God. They blame him for what happened.
They feel it's unanswered prayers, and they want answers for their things on their time, and that's not the way God works. God works on his time. So yeah, there's something there. There is something there. All right. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Gary?
it's true also. There's those that don't commit to God. They say they don't believe in God, but as soon as something goes wrong in their life, you know, they're asking others to pray. Well, who are they praying to? You know, if you don't believe in God, why are you praying to a God?
And you see people, like you're talking about, who blame God for all these catastrophes that happen around the world. Tsunamis and earthquakes and all these things. If there's a God up there, why doesn't he stop all this suffering? Why doesn't he take away all our pain? Why doesn't he do all these things if there's a God up there? And so it sets that barrier, right? Sets that doubt. Okay? So yeah, we all have barriers one way or another. We all protect our feelings. We all protect our heart. But God doesn't have those barriers. And we're going to see that as we go through these lessons. Okay? Anything else? Okay. Now, I'm going to go on to the next lesson. And the next lesson we're talking about is knowing God, what it means. Okay? So, last week we discussed relationships, what we want from them, how they are formed, what inhibits them, and what happens when they are broken. This week we want to take a closer look at those connections, and particularly our relationship with God. Our human relationships are formed with people we know, people we went to school with, people we work with, people we share common interests with, people we meet, or people we're introduced to. It is this word know we want to take a look at, and one that, as I said last week,
we tend to throw around very loosely. You may say, if I ask you, you know Tom Brady? Yeah, I know Tom Brady. You know Harrison Ford? Yeah, I know Harrison Ford. Well, have you ever sat down, had a meal? No, you've never shared any moment with them. But you know these people, right? You've seen them on TV. You know all the things that they've done. But you really don't know them. Like a relationship, close know, right? So from the human perspective, the word know can cover a range of meaning. Okay? And let me show you what I mean by this. Okay, I'm going to use this example with my wife, Crystal. Okay? If I told you Crystal's favorite color was yellow, would that tell you much about Crystal?
Sunshine.
Yeah, you might say she's my sunshine, right? But no, it's not going to say much about Crystal. If I told you her favorite flower was yellow roses, would that tell you much about Crystal?
He's from Texas.
If I told you Crystal was a lifelong San Francisco Giants fan, no matter how deluded she is, would that tell you much about Crystal?
We pray for
Exactly. Go Dodgers. So those are things that are superficial, right? That's what we kind of call a level 1 question. Now, if I told you she was allergic to amoxicillin and sulfa drugs, you would know a little bit more about her then, wouldn't you? You would know a little bit more personal things. If I told you she was a social butterfly, just the opposite of me, if I told you she was a social butterfly, you would even know a little bit more. That she can carry a conversation with you. And she's going to come up and greet you. She's going to come to your, how are you? Who are you? How can I help you kind of thing. You know, I'm not that way. I'm more like, I grew up with my mom. Unless you put your hand out, I hardly ever put it out there. I put them in my pockets. I'm not small talk kind of person. I'm just not that, I'm not built that way. Now, I could tell you then now a great deal more about Crystal. When I said, if I told you that Crystal has a passion for writing, that she is a freelance writer and writes for a local newspaper and a historical society, that tells you a little bit more, doesn't it? You know a little bit more about Crystal. And you could learn more if I told you Crystal is addicted to reading and collecting books. We have bookcases in our house and books in boxes standing on the floor. She is a collector. That would tell you a little bit more about Crystal. And I could tell you, and Don will witness this, I can tell you when we moved to our place of living in Davis, Don Farmer, who stages houses for people, was helping us arrange our furniture in the living room. And when she got done, she said, this is the perfect way to arrange your furniture. And I looked at Don, and I said, that won't do. I said, what? I said, that won't do. Because when Crystal and I are sitting down to watch TV, we like to hold hands. We hold hands when we watch TV. We got to sit next to each other. That may sound funny, but you know what? In our past relationships, our partners didn't want to hold hands, so that means a great deal to us. So in our living room, when we sit down, watch TV, she sits in one chair, I sit in another, but we got to hold hands. That tells you a great deal about Crystal, right? That tells you more about her, more personal. And then, I could tell you even more about Crystal. After we were married only 3 months, we barely knew each other when we got married. We didn't have a long courtship, okay? We fell in love in romance, more or less. Anyway, we'd been married only 3 months. The first big thing happened in our marriage was her mother passed away. I was called home from work. And I was her rock for a few months, holding and caring for her. While she wept and told stories about her mom, shared them with her sisters, went through her mother's things and her memories a great deal. She went through a lot. And I listened and I realized how lucky I was to marry her and how lucky I was to marry in such a wonderful family. So after I tell you these things, down at the bottom, you know a little bit more about Crystal, right? The experiences, the only way you can build a relationship is through experiences, through getting to know someone through the hard times, through the good times, those times you're spent together. You see, It takes time, love, commitment, communication, honesty, experience, and experiences you share in that build enough trust to allow an intimate relationship to form. You see, a house is built on a strong foundation, and then it's built board by board, brick by brick. And in the same way, our relationships are built on a strong foundation over time, board by board, brick by brick, by spending quality time with each other over the years. And that's how you form that intimate relationship. That's how it works. Okay? Any questions? Anything from there? Not doing a lot of talking, people. No, I understand. So, this is where I think we're going to get into a little bit deeper of what it means to know. What does the word mean to know God? Now, we are trying to understand and know God through the Old Testament. So the definition we are going to use is, of course, Hebrew. The Hebrew word for to know or to know something is yada. Yada, Y-A-D-A. And there is a significant difference between the Hebrew word yada and the English word know that has a profound impact, on our understanding of the most important Christian idea. I remember last week, back there, Mrs. Harbach, she was back there, Karen, she told us that Spanish had two meanings for the word know, right? She had two different words that had two different meanings. The Hebrew word is very, very much dealt in to know, and it very much has to do with intimacy. I'm going to show that to you. Okay? So we're going to look at a couple verses here and a couple different stories to help us look at and understand this word. So let's turn to Genesis 4:1. Genesis 4:1. And I'm going to read this. I want to read this from the King James Version, or the New King James Version, or some of the other versions, because it uses this word. And this is the correct translation of this word. In Genesis 4:1, it says, "Now Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, and said, I have acquired a man from the Lord." So Adam knew Eve. Now, just as information, I just want to share this with you real quick because this is important. The same word in the scripture aforementioned here in Genesis 4:1 is the exact same word yada, where David writes in Psalms 139:23, and when he says, "Search me, O God, and know my heart." Same word, know my heart, yada, right? Same word. We're talking about intimacy here. Try me and know my anxious thoughts. Know intimately, right? He's talking about intimacy. It is the same Hebrew word yada used here for Adam knowing Eve, his wife. Now, this is going to get good here. The Hebrew word for to know is yada. So then Adam yada Eve, his wife. What this verse is saying is that Adam knew his wife. And what happens is, she conceived and bore a son, Cain. So what this word is referring to, yada, is referring to sex. They had sex, right? I mean, Cain is not the result of some understanding that Adam had about Eve, some mysterious understanding or mysterious knowledge. It's not, right? So yada, this Hebrew word, is not just understanding things about someone or understanding things in general. It is not a physical exercise, but a mental exercise to know someone intimately. That's what that yada means. Okay? Yada is an intimacy relationship word. Okay? And again, yada, I want to say it, is an intimacy relationship word. It is an intimacy of the heart and mind. The word yada is concretely being used here to describe a relationship between a husband and a wife having sex, the most intimate experience we can have as humans. Now, this is an adult class, and so hang with me. Sexual intercourse is for two people who know each other intimately. Okay? They know things about each other that no one else in the world would know. They share their deepest thoughts and secrets with each other and keep no secrets from each other, nor lie to each other or have hidden agendas. Adam and Eve ended up conceiving by knowing each other so well that it led to love. And all love involves a deep knowing of someone. Knowing that person well enough that you trust that person with your life, to trust that person with your most hidden secrets. When you know someone intimately, you trust them, and you bond with them. You naturally love that person. But without love, there can be no intimacy. Okay? Jesus shows us an example of this mental exercise. If you'll turn with me to Matthew 5, 27 through 28. Matthew 5, verses 27 through 28. Would anybody like to read that? Okay, I'll read it. You have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Okay? Now, to look upon a woman, what that word is, it's an Arabic word. I think it's raza or razka, I can't remember. It's one of those two. What that means is to look. And what it generally means is you look upon a woman and not touch. But you look upon her. And that means in order to commit this adultery, you have to look upon something that is not normally visible to you. Okay? Or, simply put, what do you have to do? You have to fantasize about this woman for adultery to take place here. This man doesn't touch this woman. He does this in his heart and in his mind. So to commit that adultery, it's a mental act, not a physical one. Right? It's a mental act, not a physical one. Right? So this becomes a mental exercise, not a physical one. In other words, in the eyes of Jesus, the focus of a sexual relationship is mental, not physical. Not saying that we don't have that physical when we're married, right? I'm not saying that. I'm saying it's still a mental exercise to know that person well enough that you can be intimate with them that close. Does that make sense? Does that make sense to everybody? Any questions? Think about that for a second and let it set in. Intimacy, right? It is mental, it's not physical. So, this word yada is used in context we would never use in English. But we see it appears in another very important story, and we're going to bring that up. But I want to start talking about something that kind of adds to this stories that I want to bring. And what I want you to think about is metaphors for God. So when we think about some of the metaphors that describe God, what do you think of? When we think of the metaphors that describe our God, what do we think of?
Loving,
What's that?
loving,
Loving. Loving God. Jealous. He can be a jealous God. He's jealous for us, ain't he? He sees value in us, even when we can't see value in ourselves.
Just.
What's that?
Just.
Just. Kenny. Protective. Yeah, he's protective, right? Adjectives to describe. I'm going to throw out a few that I was thinking about when I was thinking about it. We think about God as our Heavenly Father, right? We think about God as the ultimate heavenly parent. We think about God as our shepherd, Kenny said, protector, right? We think about God as our king. And all these metaphors that we talk about and think about are very helpful, very great, very biblical, and very helpful in helping us understand our relationship with God. But now I'm going to ask you another question. last week, I asked you to think about what word or metaphor would you use to describe your relationship with God. Don?
I trust him.
Trust. Your relationship with God, you're trusting. You trust each other. Anyone else? A metaphor. Think about it. Last week, Derek hit on it, and a great deal what Derek said last week. And he already knows. Did anybody listen? Did anybody remember? Crystal.
Said it was like a marriage.
It's like a marriage, right? It's like a marriage. It's like a marriage. Anybody else? Morgan.
Long-suffering.
Long-suffering. Our relationship is long-suffering with God, sometimes. Sure. Because we live on God's time, not our own, right? We live on God's time.
Or vice versa.
Or vice versa.
And he's long-suffering with me.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's like a father-son, father-child relationship, but with the intimacy of a marriage in that you're close in your mind and your spirit. That's how I would see it.
Yeah. Yeah, very intimate. It should be very intimate with God.
Because not all father-children relationships are good.
And we don't think about it that way. We don't think about being intimate with God in that way, do we? But we should be. Because that's what God is asking for. And those verses are going to show that in just a minute here. Now, I think many would be tempted to say, maybe God is our parent, or like Brenda said, father-son relationship. And there is a good argument for that, and probably a fantastic one. But like I said, I think it's marriage. That is the most powerful metaphor for our relationship with God. And like Derek had mentioned last week, we see this in the New Testament where Paul writes about this, or John writes about this, where Paul talks about our relationship as husband and wife is like Jesus' relationship with the church. And in Revelation, where John paints a picture of the church being the bride coming to Jesus. But we are trying to know God through the Old Testament. So I want us to turn to Hosea. I want us to turn to Hosea, where God compares Israel, his people, to a bride, and God himself to a groom. Now, when we read these scriptures, we will see they are married together, and things have not gone well in this marriage. And that is a powerful analogy that he uses, which is not uncommon because it appears many times in the Bible. So let's turn to Hosea 2, 19 through 20. Now, just to set up a little bit of history here, these people have been extremely unfaithful to God. Okay? And they are about to go in exile. This is Israel. He says here, I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you to me in righteousness and in justice, in loving kindness and in compassion. And I will betroth you to me in faithfulness. And then you will know, yada, right? Yada. You will know the Lord. That's talking about something intimate when he's talking about betrothed to me. Right? I will betroth you to me. You will be wed to me. Right? So, the whole analogy here, again, is a marriage one. And like it says, things have not gone well throughout this marriage. We've already seen that concrete sense what Yadai refers to in Genesis 4:1 that we talked about. So when you say you will know the Lord, what he is saying, what he is talking about, is you will have that intimate relationship with him. That's what it's about. He's talking to Israel here. That's what it's about. I will betroth myself to you. He is saying we're going to be in a marriage together. And in fact, that is what has been happening, but you haven't been faithful to me. You haven't been faithful at all. So again, we see that it's more than a father-son relationship. It's more like what is found in a marriage, that closeness and understanding that exists between a husband and a wife. Let's turn to Isaiah 54:4. Isaiah 54:4. Would someone like to read that for me? Please. No one? Jeff, thank you. Appreciate it.
For your husband is your maker, whose name is the Lord of hosts, and your Redeemer is the Holy One of Israel, who is called the God of all the earth.
Yeah. What does the scripture portray? It portrays our relationship with God as a marriage, right? That's what it's portraying here. As a married couple, you say things to each other and come to a closeness with each other. You talk about things you don't talk about with other people. You share your dreams, your fears, your mistakes, the things you love, because you feel safe with that person. This not only helps you understand each other on a level no one else can reach or touch, but it draws you very close to one another. For example, how many times have you been out together and something happens? You see a child at a counter trying to get a toy, screaming its head off, wanting a toy or a piece of candy. And a young mother can't control this child, right? She just can't seem to get control of the situation. Or you're at a doctor's office, and there's two children there, and one child picks up a toy and throws it at the other kid and hits him in the face, right? Seen that happen. Not on purpose, but it does happen. The other child's screaming its head off. You just can't seem to control the situation you're in. And the two of you, the husband and wife, you just looked at each other knowing what the other is thinking. You exchange that look or expression that conveys you both feel the same about what just happened. And you do it without one word being exchanged. How many times have we done that as a married couple? Many, many times, right? We don't want to get involved, but we definitely know what's going on. Hold on, Morgan, I'll get right with you. It is the idea that their hearts and minds are so connected at that point that they are one. We've all had that experience at one point or another, right? You don't want to get involved with what's going on with this young mother or something happening, but you look at each other and go, man, I've been there. And you know what each other is thinking. Many situations we've been like that, right? You don't have to say a word. You know what each other is thinking. You know each other that well. Morgan.
So I'm gonna throw you a curve here. So how does fear work into that?
How does what?
Fear.
Fear.
Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, no?
Yeah.
So how does fear work into our relationship with God as well as fear of our relationship with one another in a marriage?
How does fear work?
How does fear work into that?
I have to think about that. I don't think fear works in it. Listen, I'll give you an analogy real quick. And I was going to save this for another time, and I was going to save this for Tuesday night with Brenda, but I'm going to share this with you. And this is how I feel it goes. And then, Jeff, I'll get to you. This is an analogy that I have with our relationship with God. I've been thinking about this all week long. And I want you to think about a storm. Okay? I want you to think about a storm. How many of us have seen a great big storm coming? Many, right? And we look in the distance and we see that storm coming. And we see that lightning strike from a distance. We see it light up the sky. We see the power that's happening. And what's that like for us? It's beautiful, right? It's majestic when it's at a distance. It's beautiful when it's at a distance. It's majestic. It's authoritative. But then we feel the rush of that wind coming to us and the storm's coming to us. And what happens to us? We begin to get a little apprehensive, don't we? Oh, the storm's coming. What'll I do? Should I get in the basement? Maybe it could be a tornado. How strong is this storm? But it's coming near, and you feel that uneasiness. That feeling you get when you heard that saying, something wicked this way comes, right? You get that uneasy feeling because you don't know what's going to happen. Is it going to go to the east or the west or the north or the south? Is it going to pass by my house? or is it coming right at me? But then the storm comes to you, all right? The storm comes to you. And how many have been in the middle of a lightning storm, very close, lightning strikes? I have. I've been the one that hit less than 8 feet from my house. It reminded me that I was sitting there when I was on Davis Road at the house, and the lightning struck our pond as I was looking at it through the window. And as soon as that struck, I turned away in fear, not knowing where it was going to go. Was it going to hit me? Was it going to bounce and hit me? So I turned in fear and tucked away. Okay? I turned in fear and ducked away because I was afraid of its power, of what was there in the moment. Okay? I'm going to use this analogy like God. When we see God in the distance, he looks beautiful. He looks majestic. He looks authoritative. But as God starts coming close, if you don't know him, it creates that apprehension, right? If you don't know him, it creates that fear. And then when it comes close, if you don't know God and that lightning strikes, you see its power. The ground shakes. Lightning fills the room. It's all those things happening at once in that room, right? It's all those things happening. And you can feel fear if you don't know God or don't know that power. Or you know what? In the moment, if you know it, then you can feel relaxed and at peace. And it's not fear anymore if you know God. Right? Because perfect love, God's perfect love, casts out all fear. I got Brenda's, and I think that's it for me. I think they're telling me I got to get rid of class. I'm sorry, guys. I didn't hear the buzzer go off.
I think if you go back to what he betrothed you in righteousness,
In righteousness.
justice, loving kindness, compassion, and faithfulness, those qualities, if you develop those qualities, I think that casts out a lot of that fear. Because perfect love casts out any fear. And
Tough. Yeah. Something we develop, but it don't happen overnight, right?
It's a time of development, but
It
it's
is.
still, that's what he's betrothing you in.
Yeah. All right. I will see you next week.
It is good to be back. It's good to get away sometimes, but it's good to be back.
Went to Dallas to see Doug and Patty's new house and their new grandbaby, and turned me down a little bit then. Went to church in Mesquite, Texas, and I was told, I said, now how do they dress for church? And Patty says, oh, suits and ties. Walked in, there's a bunch of cowboys and Wranglers, cowboy boots, and even the preacher included. But no, we had a good time. Stopped in Searcy for all you Hardingettes, and spent the night there one night. But it was nice to be there. The wooden trays, you know, like an elephant in the room. These were donated to the church as a gift in honor of someone here. Anonymous gift for an anonymous receiver. But they're nice. But I'll warn you now, they're a little heavier than the old ones. So nobody grab them and drop them all of a sudden, all right? But I think really what it was is people were tired of this all the time. And since 2 weeks ago, Liam about dropped the whole stack trying to get out with them because nobody stacked them well. But no, it was a very nice and I think a beautiful gift to the church. So this week, the lesson is called Going After God, and we're going back into our series of stories that you should be telling your children and grandchildren, the great bedtime stories that turn into lessons for life. I was visiting with a fellow just earlier in the week this week, and we were talking about worship. And so the question was, and I get this all the time, before somebody wants to even think about studying, they want to know about what is church like for Church of Christ. And so we had this discussion, and his comment he made was, you know, I'm not real happy where we go. In fact, I usually skip the first 20, 30 minutes. And I said, why is that? And he said, because it's more about entertaining each other with the live band and the loud music and the people shouting the same chorus for 20 minutes than it is about worshiping God. And he said, I mean, what does the Bible say about worshiping God? And I told him, you know, in the Greek, it means to kiss upwards. And, you know, you're speaking to God. You're worshiping God, not each other, and not the talents of a rock band, you know. Well, that's kind of today's lesson, because we're going to see people coming to the reality it's not about me and my brethren, it's about God and us. And so here's the deal. David has been named king of Israel, and he's pretty secure in the position, and everyone's gathered around him, and he was grateful for that. But he realized that King Saul had led them away from God. They weren't worshiping the way they should. And in fact, they had just totally lost sight of what relationship with God is all about. So David says, you know, I've got to bring them back. We've got to seek God. And if you get nothing else from today, get those words. You need to seek after God. Tom was using the analogy of the betrothal of us and God, and that's true. And he talked about the looks between husband and wife, been married a while. You don't have to say anything. You just look at each other, and you know what the other one's thinking or what they're about to say. And the way you get to that point is studying each other, sometimes for years. Sometimes it clicks fairly quickly. But with God, it requires us to live a life of study and obedience. And once you do that, once you've done that for a while, you don't really have to think about a lot of things. How you should react and respond, what you should do, comes pretty natural at some point, just like it does in the marriage relationship. I mean, you know, if you have studied and learned that this is wrong, then this is right or wrong, because you understand the way God thinks and the way God does. And so David says, we got to lead you back. And he knew that they would never be where they should be until they returned the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem. So the Ark had been stolen, and what has happened is, this is vital to their worship. I mean, the Ark is central to their worship. In fact, if you went into battle, right, normally we think of a battle and we think of soldiers carrying the American flag and a unit flag. First time I came to live in Freeport, I was assigned to 85th Division in Rockford, to the Army Reserve Unit there. And as soon as I walked in, I went, oh, you've got Custer's banner. And they said, yeah, because you're now in the Custer Division. And I said, are we cursed or something? I don't want to be in this unit. But anyway, you know, the Custer Division, and we would carry that flag, and we wore it on our shoulder, a thing that said Custer's Division. And so 75 years before, not before me coming here, 75 years before David, the people had lost the ark to the Philistines. It was a bad choice on the Philistines because things started going wrong for them. It was terrible. They're being punished. In fact, there's a story about, I assume it's Dagon, but Dagon was a Philistine god. And they brought the ark, this image of God, the God of Israel, and set it in the temple next to Dagon. And the next morning, the priests come in, and Dagon is laying across the doorway, no head, no arms, no legs, just a torso. So they didn't even spend a lot of time thinking about it. Get that out of here. And they got the ark out, and they parked it somewhere. And so it's been there, and Israel has been without this symbol of God in their worship and in their battles. And David says, it's got to come back. Well, we don't have an ark. And we don't have symbols that we hold as holy beyond the communion service. But even the symbols of the table and the trays and all, they're not holy. They're just set apart for something. But we still need to have the presence of God in our worship and in our daily lives as much as Israel did. And maybe it's harder without a symbol. I don't know. You know, maybe that's something you could look onto. The way I grew up in a Southern conservative church, we didn't wear a cross. We didn't do all that because it was drilled into us, we don't need that symbol. I think sometimes it's good. I think it's good to have that. I bought Liam a T-shirt for camp that says, I stand for the flag, but I kneel for God. Sometimes those symbols help us. But this passage is going to talk a lot about chasing after God as David and his people chase after their ark. And there's some simple highlights we're going to look at today. Let's start with our reading, Morgan. I love to give Morgan long ones. And then we'll move into our lesson.
Good morning. The reading this morning comes from 2 Samuel chapter 6, verses 1 through 19. David again brought together all the able men, young men of Israel, 30,000. He and all his men went to Baalah and Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim on the ark. They set the ark of God on a new cart, and brought it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. Uzzah and Ahio, sons of Abinadab, were guiding the new cart with the ark of God on it, and Ahio was walking in front of it. David and all Israel were celebrating with all their might before the Lord, with castanets, harps, lyres, timbrels, cisterns, and cymbals. When they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out and took hold of the ark of God because the oxen stumbled. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act. Therefore, God struck him down, and he died there beside the ark of God. Then David was angry because of the Lord's wrath had broken out against Uzzah, and to this day that place is called Perez-Uzzah. David was afraid of the Lord that day and said, "How can the ark of the Lord ever come to me?" He was not willing to take the ark of the Lord to be with him in the city of David. Instead, he took it to the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite. And the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite, for 3 months. And the Lord blessed him and his entire household. Now King David was told, "The Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and everything he has because of the ark of God." So David went to bring up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. When those who were carrying the ark of the Lord had taken 6 steps, he sacrificed a bull and a fattened calf. Wearing a linen ephod David was dancing before the Lord with all his might, while he and all Israel were bringing up the ark of the Lord with shouts and sounds of trumpets. As the ark of the Lord was entering the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, watched from a window. And when she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. They brought the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings before the Lord. After he had finished sacrificing the burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord Almighty. Then he gave a loaf of bread, a cake of dates, a cake of raisins to each person in the whole crowd of Israelites, both men and women, and all the people went to their homes.
Thank you. I know sometimes it makes people nervous when you have to read and there's a lot of names. Here's the deal. You can't insult them. They've been dead for thousands of years. So it's okay. Just wing it. All right, so first off, one of the points that jumps out at me as we get in this reading is Uzzah dies because he's irreverent, and David gets mad. You remember that when you were a kid? You do something wrong, and you get caught, and you get, in my house, a whipping, and you'd be mad at your parents for it. Well, that's dumb. They didn't do anything wrong, and they were trying to teach me not to do it wrong again. Yeah, I know some of your stories, Bernetta. You know, her mother believed in spanking. I'm just going to say, Jeffy believed in discipline, raising up a child with discipline. But, you know, we get mad at our parents. That's silly. We don't get mad at God when we've sinned and he corrects us. We take it as a life lesson and say, I need to move and do better. And so start doing better. But anyway, David is possessed with this holy desire. I've got to get the ark back to its place. We cannot worship correctly without God's seat being in the temple. He wants God at the center of the heart of the nation. He wants God at the center of the religion of the nation, of their worship of the nation. David wants God's presence, and he knows until they make their lives right, he's not going to have that. And there's no ulterior motives here. He's not thinking that the ark will make them invincible to other nations. He doesn't think it will make him the greatest king in history or let him live forever. He just knows he wants the glory of God back at center to their life. If you don't have God centered in your life, you will never be right. You think about something you build, and if you cut corners and you don't true up the corners and you don't get it all square, does the table ever sit right? We went into a restaurant the other day, and the table was so wonky. And so we asked the girl to bring a sweetener for the tea, and I took the whole stack and stuck it under the leg of the table because it was driving me crazy, just constantly rocking and banging. And that's your life without God. You cannot be centered. You cannot be true. You're going to be rocking, and it will drive you crazy. So we need to do that. We need to see God glorified in all that we do and all that we say. Now, I was asked one time, I said, you have a lot of stories about people asking you things about church. Sure I do. When you live a certain way and you put out there your faith very plain and very open, people are going to ask questions. They're going to want to know. I try to let people all the time know where we go to church, that I'm a minister, and that's secondary to being a member, but, you know, so that they will ask questions. So put God out there. And he also knew, because he had a humble heart, they would not be anything without the presence of God. They don't have the ability to fend for themselves, to take care of themselves. They need God. They need his presence and power. Ben was talking about, I guess there was a story in the paper recently, and I found 3 others, Ben, today, of parents that left their children at home and they went on vacation. A mother left a very young baby with 2 bottles and left for a week in the crib. Now, she has mental illness, obviously. But then as I'm looking at that story to read it, I find 2 other people just recently in the last few weeks that left their children home for a week or more to fend for themselves. Children can't fend for themselves yet. You, without God, cannot fend for yourselves because you're a child. We cannot do that. So David sets out to restore the ark to its rightful place. We need a heart that beats in tune with God. We need a heart that seeks his power and his presence. We can do nothing without him. In John chapter 15 and verse 5, I am the vine and you are the branches. Well, the branches can't grow without the vine being strong and receiving nutrient. The one who remains in me and I in him bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing apart from God. Apart from God, you can't do anything. We must have his presence and his power if we're going to serve him, if we're going to worship, if we're going to live out our I don't know what the word is, our purpose in life. Like David and Israel, it is time for the church to rise up and seek after God. Now, this whole situation is created by a faulty decision in this story today. It says that they set the ark on a new cart. David says, man, we'll build a nice cart. I mean, this is going to be the, whatever is the best brand these days. This is going to be the best brand of cart that has ever been created. Maybe it had gilded wheels. Maybe the oxen were decorated. I don't know, but he wanted to honor the ark. But it was a faulty decision because he didn't ask God, how are we supposed to do this? He didn't look back. And you got to wonder about what kind of priesthood lets their king make such a big mistake. Surely they knew the word. Unfortunately, there's a whole lot of church leadership in the world that doesn't know the word of God. They're just walking out there blindly doing what feels good, what makes them think. So in Exodus chapter 24, we know they were told to use 2 long gold-covered staffs through rings to lift it. And then, let's get real specific. The men of Kohath are to carry it. Not anybody else. Just the men of this tribe have been chosen to do that. And so they do that. Numbers chapter 3 and verse 30 talks about that, as well as chapter 14, chapter 7. I mean, the word was in the writings of Moses. They could read it. They could know. So David made good plans. He made good preparations, but he didn't make it within God's rules and God's will. He paid a high price for this decision. He didn't seek God before he made the decision. Up to this moment, David has always gone to God for guidance. He's praying. He's asking time and again. He asks for God to help him. But here he doesn't. He just assumes if I do this to the glory of God, he'll accept it. He follows the methods of the world, the new cart. Churches are always seeking after something new. And sometimes we can shake things up a little bit and do some things just to make the worship more impactful maybe. But at the same time, we still are limited by what God has asked of us, what God has told us to do. And so when the Philistines had the ark and wanted to return it to Israel, they also put it on a new cart. But they're not people of God. And of course we know the Bible said they were suffering for it. And it was also, this problem is not just bad planning, it was foolish disobedience. For the first 2 miles of the cart's going along, and if you've ever seen an ox cart or a mule-drawn cart, it's not the smoothest ride in the world. And so the ark is kind of rocking. And poor Uzzah, I feel bad for the guy, I really do. Because he just wanted to protect it. This was a holy thing. But again, the rules were clear. Do not touch my seat, my ark. Don't do it. In the Bible, we have precepts and we have principles. A precept is to be obeyed. There is no wiggle room. When God posts a 55 mile an hour, there's no 9 mile an hour grace period. You do what God said. You follow his rules. He expects absolute obedience. Regardless of the time or the circumstance, God has made a rule, a precept. If God posts a sign that says, watch out for children. Well, that's a principle. Just be a little more careful in this area. Doesn't mean you necessarily have to slow down, but it'd be a good idea. In other words, a principle is to be applied with wisdom. A precept is to be obeyed. A heart that's going after God will not dishonor God by breaking his precepts and principles. God is intensely interested in those things of life. You can give God great honor by a little thing in life. Or you can bring him great dishonor by a little thing in life. Does God's reaction seem harsh to you? Well, at first read, it is harsh. Uzzah just wanted to do this good thing. But that is the price for disobedience. If you think Uzzah's death was, at least he died instantly. God has said we will suffer the same fate at the end of time if we disobey him. So your obedience, your worship, your life is a matter of life and death with God. I wish we could portray that to the world in a way that they would get it, but it is. It's a matter of life and death. God honors obedience, and he judges disobedience. So there's some other truths we need to follow here and take note of. God's blessings only come through obedience. Those who defy him pay a terrible price. The Philistines realized that first thing. It's like, man, we shouldn't have messed with this. We shouldn't have done this. And we see in the home of Obed, blessings came from doing things correctly. The best thing a child of God can do is align themselves with God's word and walk in humble obedience. It's really not that hard. And we are so blessed because we don't have nearly the rules that Israel had. But we have principles to live by that reflect on the precepts that we've been given. Again, a life of study of God, you'll know what to do without having to look up the specific book, chapter, and verse. Failing to seek God's will is just as dangerous as ignoring what he's already told you to do. Trying to carry out God's business using the methods of the world is a recipe for disaster. All right, let's be frank. We could shake up our worship in a big way, and we could probably attract more people. Well, there's a lot of things we could do to make the people of the world want to come and worship with us this way. But we choose to do what we do because we just want to be obedient in simplicity. This fellow I was saying, he goes, well, what kind of music do y'all have? And I said, we sing. We sing to God. He said, is there a verse that absolutely says you can't have instruments? And I said, no. Then why don't you? Because we worship with our voice. We're not an audience at a concert watching someone else worship. We join together to worship God. It's simple. It's beautiful. And we know that that is obedient. We have no business trying to change our cart to look like the world. It needs to be carried on the shoulders of the people and in the hearts of the people of God. Like Uzzah, we can be guilty of reaching out thinking we're doing something good, but we're not doing it in accordance with God's will. We're guilty of trying to do spiritual work using the power of the flesh. We attempt to do the work of God with our hands, but we never really get under the burden. We never ask God for guidance. We never look to his word when we're making decisions. That never works. God won't bless us when we're going off on our own, trying to do what we think is best, no matter the intentions, if we're disobedient. So this man, excuse me, I love spring, but it does not love me. It doesn't help, traveling halfway across the country and turn around and running straight back again a few days later. But this whole event manifested a change in David's attitude. David had forgotten the reasons he was going after the ark in the first place. He is reminded when he hears of the blessings that have been happening at the house of Obed-Edom. Now he says, oh, wait a minute, that's why we need the ark, because God will bless us for taking care of this. And it changed his approach on all this. I love it. So Uzzah dies. David goes home and regroups for 3 months. Well, it was a good idea, folks, but do we really want to do this now? Let's think about this. How many more of us have to die before we do it right? Either someone told David how the ark was supposed to be done, or he researched it, went to his priest and said, y'all better figure this out. Either way, when he brings it home the next way, the right way, God blesses that. In fact, just to be sure that everything's okay, he stops after just a few steps and says, okay, let's just do a sacrifice in case. Let's just make sure we're doing this God's way. When the Lord didn't kill anybody, they decided this must be the right way. Let's keep going. And they carried it on to Jerusalem. And it's funny, you know, David was known as a great musician, but he's kind of given that up for dancing in this episode. Now, if you've been to church camp, you have heard David went naked through the streets. He did not go naked through the streets. It more to David was running around out there. Instead of his kingly robes, he was wearing a pair of cut-off Levi's and no shirt. That's really what he's doing. He was covered. But his wife wasn't happy with that. In fact, she was really unhappy because she said he gave up his dignity. And she even said, the serving girls have seen you in your nakedness. And of course, I love David. We'll see what David here at the end of this. But it's a great response. And it's a great response to how our heart should be. But David's been transformed into a seeker, not a king. He goes after God with the presence and the power of God, and that makes him want to praise God and worship. It comes out in him in dancing and shouting. He's praising God with all of his heart and all of his mind, and he doesn't care how anyone else judges him. Over the years here, I've been asked a couple questions. One of them was, and these were in the church, should I wear a head covering? And I said, well, that's up to you. It's not an unbiblical principle, but I don't see that the Bible commands you to. Well, I think I should. Then by all means, cover your head as a sign of respect. But I don't really want to. Then figure that out, because you don't want to violate your conscience. So figure it out. The other question, a person said, I just don't feel I can worship here. Why not? Well, I want to lift my hands when we sing. Who's stopping you? Well, I don't think the elders would let me. And all three of us said, did we ever say you couldn't lift hands? There's a comedian that teaches a class online, if you want to see it, on how to lift hands. If you never knew before, it's hilarious. But the one overreaching principle, and it's one that we told the person, was you can praise vertically, just not horizontally. You got to stay in your spot. But other than that, we don't care. We don't want you violating your conscience in worship. Obviously, we don't want you hurting somebody else's ability to worship, but living in disobedience and in the power of the flesh always results in bondage. When you start thinking, I want to do what makes me happy, regardless of what makes God happy, you're in trouble. You're in trouble. And by the way, you can't cherry pick. I like these rules. I don't like these rules. It's one set of rules. Listen to God. Obey God. No amount of someday I will repent and I'll make it okay. That's a dangerous philosophy. When I worked with the church in Germany, we had the German church was all old ladies and a few babies. Church that I worked with, it was all old ladies, and one man. But they said that the philosophy of young Germans was, we're going to live life. Things were bad back, a generation ago. We're going to live life, and someday we'll repent and go to God when we get old. And we'll make everything all right. Ain't nobody got a guarantee of longevity. He did not guarantee you 70 years. We all know how that goes in society. You've not been guaranteed. So anyway, David went after God the wrong way, gets his hand slapped. He does it again. When he started doing things God's way, his life gets changed. It's revolutionized. It's so much better. He goes after God's presence. He goes after God's power. And he did it God's way. So what about you? Are you seeking God and His power and His presence in your life today? Are you seeking Him His way? So Derek, I think it was in his class, mentioned it the other day, talking about a Bible that doesn't have the chapters and verses. I went out and bought one because I thought, I need to find a way to shake up my Bible reading, to reinvigorate it. I'll let you know. I'll let you borrow it if it works for me. But it's all about seeking God and finding new ways to keep seeking God, to refresh yourself and seek God. In fact, if you know, 10, 15 years ago, I went away for a week of just total solitude and read the entire New Testament in that week in just absolute silence. Whatever it takes, get back to God. Find ways to refresh your own spirit. So are you seeking Him in His way or your own way? Are you walking in obedience to all the things, to His precepts and His principles? If you've been hitting a brick wall in your quest for God, let David set you on the right path. Go after God with all you have in your heart and your soul, your mind, obedience, with your strength. But be sure you do it in His way. So here's back to the story of David dancing in his Levi's. His wife is so embarrassed. And David's response to her is this: I was dancing before the Lord, who chose me above your father and all of his family. He appointed me as the leader of Israel, the people of the Lord. So I am celebrating before the Lord. Yes, I am willing to look even more foolish than this, even to be humiliated in my own eyes. But those servant girls you mentioned will indeed think I am distinguished. If you put all of your heart, soul, mind, and body into serving God, don't let anybody make you feel foolish. Again, I'll be a fool for God any day, if that's what it takes for me to show the world who our God is. And you should too. Look, I get that it's hard. In fact, we had a guy come here and do a week-long meeting many years ago. Alice and I took him over to Country Junction when it was open. And I got to admit, I was a little embarrassed. I'm not afraid to tell people I'm a preacher. I'm not afraid to tell people we go to church all the time. But this guy stopped the waitress and said, we're getting ready to pray for our meal. Do you want us to pray for something for you? Is there anybody here that needs something? We'll pray for anybody. And I'm like, dude, seriously, stop. Because it's kind of like that worship this way and not that way. He was going that way. And I was uncomfortable. And I very quickly learned a valuable lesson when she almost tearfully told us of something going on in her life, and she would really love it if we would pray for that. Now, I'll be honest, I am not brave enough still to just approach strangers and say, I want to pray for you today. What can I pray for you about? I am plenty brave if someone says, preacher, someone I know in the community, would you pray about this? The fellow I talked to this week, would you pray about it? Yeah, I'd love to. We need to learn not to worry about looking like a fool in front of the world. We just need to serve our God 100% all the time. If we can help you as you struggle to obey, as you struggle to walk, and as you struggle to get over looking like a fool, we want to do that. Whether it's study, whether you need to repent of something in your life and get back closer to God, repentance is great. It's a do-over. God says, I forgive you, start over again. Try again. Or if you've not ever been a child of God, then you have no hope of being obedient to God until you do the things He asks you to do to get in union with Him, into that, through the betrothal and into the marriage part we talked about this morning. If we can help you with that, we'd love to sit down and study with you. Whatever you need, please come while together we stand and while we sing.